You expect the highest office to arrive by ballot. This one arrived by resignation twice, and the man who stepped into it had never won a single national vote for executive power. Not for president, not even for vice president. At the time, the country was exhausted, angry, and watching the White House like a crime scene. What came next was even more significant than the headline suggested, because the transfer of power would test whether American democracy could hold when the public's trust had collapsed. Gerald Ford Jr. did not look like a revolutionary. He carried himself like a dependable Midwestern congressman, the kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered names. He had been a college athlete who traded the gridiron for war service, then for law, then for the long grind of elected office in Michigan. In the House of Representatives, he rose through patience and relationships until he became minority leader, a figure who understood procedure, party discipline, and the quiet leverage of seniority. He had also served on the Warren Commission after President Kennedy's assassination, an assignment that placed him inside one of the nation's most scrutinized investigations long before his name would be tied to presidential succession. But that wasn't the real turning point. The real turning point was happening in the shadows of 1774, where secrets, tapes, and cover stories were pulling an administration apart. To understand Ford's ascent, you have to rewind to the vice presidency itself. When scandal forced Spiro Agnew from office, he resigned on October 10, 1973. The nation faced an unusual constitutional problem. The second-in-line seat was empty while the presidency was already drowning in Watergate. A crisis rooted in the 1972 break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters and the cover-up that followed. Under the 25th Amendment, Richard Nixon nominated a replacement. Ford, widely respected across party lines in Congress, was the choice Nixon put forward. The confirmation hearings were serious, televised, and unavoidably political because everyone understood the stakes. If the presidency fell next, this vice president would inherit the world's most powerful desk without having been chosen by voters for that role. The Senate confirmed him on November 27, 1973, by a vote of 92-3. The House followed on December 6, voting 387-35. Ford was sworn in as vice president that same December day and suddenly stood one heartbeat away from a presidency that was visibly fracturing. At the time, no one realized how quickly that proximity would become literal. In the months that followed, the judiciary kept closing the space around Nixon. In July of 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the president had to surrender key Watergate tapes, a decision scholars treat as a decisive narrowing of executive secrecy in that crisis. The House Judiciary Committee had approved articles of impeachment. The walls were not metaphorical anymore. They were procedural, legal, and public. But that wasn't the end of the pressure. What came next was even more significant for the country's emotional temperature. The presidency itself began to look less like a fortress and more like a countdown. And then something unexpected happened, not in the sense of a twist from fiction, but in the sense of history accelerating. The evidence and pressure surrounding Watergate surged. Nixon's support eroded in Congress and in the country. On August 8, 1974, Nixon announced he would resign. The resignation became effective at noon the next day, a detail that made the transfer feel almost engineered for order, an attempt to keep the machinery from shaking apart. On August 9, Ford, who had never been elected vice president by the voters, took the oath as President of the United States in the East Room, with the ritual dignity of the office colliding with the raw shame of the moment. In remarks afterward, he tried to steady the nation with plain language, including the line that became instantly famous, that America's long national nightmare was over. A government that prized elections had just placed its chief executive through succession, not suffrage. The irony was impossible to ignore. Stability arrived through an appointed path, while millions of citizens still wondered whether justice would arrive at all. Ford's first days were a tightrope stretched over a canyon. He spoke of openness, of calm, of healing. He wanted Americans to believe institutions could function again, but that wasn't the end of the turbulence. What happened next changed everything in the public mind. On September 8, 1974, Ford pardoned Richard Nixon for offenses connected to Watergate. Ford framed it as a way to spare the country a prolonged, divisive legal spectacle. Critics exploded. To many citizens, it looked like accountability had been erased before it could truly begin. Protests surged. Trust, already fragile, collapsed further for a segment of the electorate. Historians still debate the pardon's long-term effects, but the immediate emotional cost was unmistakable. A presidency born in crisis now carried the weight of a decision that felt, to many, like a door slammed shut on the clearest demand of the moment. Ford spent months defending the pardon under relentless scrutiny, including congressional appearances where he insisted there had been no corrupt bargain tying Nixon's resignation to future mercy. Supporters read that as integrity under fire. Opponents read it as Washington protecting its own. The argument never fully cooled. It became part of the decades-low hum under every later choice about trust. Ford governed through inflation, energy anxiety, and the bitter aftershocks of Vietnam. His administration wrestled with economic pain that pressed ordinary families hard, turning kitchen table worry into a national mood. He promoted voluntary anti-inflation appeals symbolized by "Whip Inflation Now" buttons. That became part of the era's cultural memory, even as the underlying economic forces refused to bend to slogans. Abroad, he navigated a world still shaped by Cold War tension and shifting alliances. The Mayaguez incident in 1975, when a U.S. merchant crew was seized and a risky rescue operation followed, became a flashpoint of fear and controversy, with human loss sharpening the debate over judgment, timing, and the use of force. For millions watching at home, the episode sharpened a post-Vietnam question that refused polite answers: when American force saves lives and when it simply trades one grief for another. In that atmosphere, presidential judgment itself felt exposed. Yet Ford also pursued diplomacy where possible. The Helsinki Accords of 1975, signed with Soviet leadership among others, advanced human rights language that would echo for decades. Even as critics argued it lent legitimacy the United States should not offer, Republican fractures did not vanish with Nixon's departure. Ford still had to govern a party, arguing with itself while Democrats held congressional majorities. He nominated Nelson Rockefeller to fill the vice presidency under the 25th Amendment. After another grinding confirmation process, Rockefeller took office in December of 1974, restoring a two-person line of succession that looked orderly on paper even when the era felt anything but orderly. Domestically, Ford vetoed bills he saw as inflationary, clashed with a Congress that sometimes overrode him, and tried to steer the ship without the mandate that usually accompanies an inaugural victory. He was not a man who had climbed the mountain through a national campaign for the top job. He had been handed the wheel while the engine smoked. That difference mattered. It shaped how allies tested him, how opponents framed him, and how the public measured his legitimacy. Even his body became part of the story's tension. Separate assassination attempts in California in 1975, one in early September. Another weeks later reminded the country that political violence still lived at the edge of the national imagination. And then something unexpected happened again, this time at the ballot box he finally sought. In 1976, Ford ran for the presidency on his own terms, fighting through a bruising Republican primary against Ronald Reagan. He secured the nomination in a convention fight that left scars inside his party, then faced Jimmy Carter in a general election that stayed competitive to the end. Ford campaigned as the steady steward of a country that needed repair, not drama. Carter campaigned as an outsider promising honesty after Watergate. Televised debates became turning points in the public narrative. One misstep over Eastern Europe haunted Ford's effort in the eyes of many viewers. When the votes were counted, Carter won roughly 300 electoral votes to Ford's roughly 240, while the popular vote remained close enough to feel like a nation split down the middle. The transfer of power was peaceful, no small fact in a story built on crisis. But for Ford, the outcome was personal. The only presidency he ever held had begun without an election, and ended with one he did not win. After January 20th, 1977, Ford lived as a former president in the long shadow of what he had done and what voters had never directly awarded him. Years later, perspective softened for some observers. Awards and retrospectives noted Ford's decency, his resistance to petty cruelty, his willingness to absorb public fury rather than escalate it. In 1999, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He died on December 26, 2006, closing a life that entered the national story through emergency succession rather than a march of primaries. But the central fact remains stark in the textbooks. Other unelected presidents had at least won the vice presidency on a national ticket before fate elevated them. Ford did not. Among American presidents, he stands alone in this specific way. He reached the Oval Office without ever being elected president or vice president by the American electorate. That is not a gimmick for trivia night. It is a reminder of how constitutions behave under stress, how succession can replace selection, and how quickly calm assumptions about democracy can be replaced by paperwork, procedure, and the heavy quiet of an oath taken in a wounded republic. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, like the video and subscribe for more weekly breakdowns. The story does not end with one man's career. It ends with attention democracies never finish answering. When the system saves itself through rules instead of votes, the cost often lands in trust, and the echo can last longer than any single administration. Gerald Ford's legacy reminds us that leadership isn't always sought. Sometimes it is a duty thrust upon us by history. He stepped into the storm not by the power of a vote, but by the strength of his character, proving that a healer is often exactly what a nation needs most.